The Forces of Fantasy, Warhammer Fantasy and then some Archive. I'm your host, GJ. Join me as we take a chronological look at all the materials that have been released for Warhammer Fantasy battles and related games. We are going to take a look at the Forces of Fantasy box set today. I put up a video on the Patreon where I am doing a sort of unboxing. It is, well, of course it's not really an unboxing because the box has been opened before, but it is sort of new to me. This is just me leafing through the books, it's trying to get my first impression of them. And in this podcast, I will not tell you everything that's in the video, and in the video I won't tell you everything that's going to be on the podcast. So we will be taking a look at these books. I'm not going over all the rules as usual, but I will talk about what's in them and what it does and what you can use them for. So in the Forces of Fantasy box there are 3 books. The first one is called Forces of Fantasy. The second one is called Fighting Fantasy Battles, and the third one is called Arcane Magicks. Now, these books, I'm not sure if we are going to make it through all of them today. If not, we'll save some for the next episode. Before we dive into the box, there are a few things that have been released in White Dwarf magazine leading up to the release of these books. Now, I have not been able to find exactly when Forces of Fantasy was released. I did find an estimate by a gentleman, I think it's a gentleman, who has a website dedicated to the history of Warhammer Fantasy roleplay. This website is Awesome Lies. You can find it at awesomeliesblog.wordpress.com. He's basically doing the same thing. Oh, well, it just says here, his name's Gideon. So he's basically doing the same thing that I am doing with Warhammer Fantasy, except that he's focusing on fantasy roleplay. And he is much more thorough than I am. Forces of Fantasy, to his best estimate, was released in or around March 1984. Now, in the lead up to this, we get a couple of adverts in White Dwarf. The first of these was in White Dwarf 49, which is January 1984. This was a rather irregular advert in that it was not just a picture of the box and this is what you're getting. It was actually the rules for dwarves, the dwarf faction. And these rules are the same as they are in the in the book that was actually released. So if you had a subscription to White Dwarf, you got those rules for free. Then the next month in February, White Dwarf 50, they did exactly the same for Dark Elves, an advert plus the rules. And then in White Dwarf 51, which was released in March 1984, they just put in an advert. And there's also an article there which is called Watch Out, There's a Thief About. This article we are not going to discuss today, but I will do it for the next episode or maybe one after that, depending on how everything goes. And then we will take a look at several of the White Dwarf articles in order that have been released about Warhammer Fantasy, 1st edition and Forces of Fantasy. There are a couple of reviews there. There's some scenarios, some extra rules and everything. And then after that, it's on to the 2nd Citadel Compendium. And then already we are in Warhammer 2nd edition. So 1st edition didn't really have a long life. I'm going to be curious to see why. And hopefully we can figure that out. Maybe if you were around back in the day, if you have played this, just let me know, get in touch, and I'm happy to ask you a couple of questions, pick your brain a little bit on the podcast, not in the Ghoul King style, of course, but in the figurative style. And I'm really curious to see how everybody back in the day was playing this, how it was received back in the day. So if you were around then, and if you're listening to the podcast, just get in touch. Just find me on Facebook or leave a message on. I think you can contact me through Podbean or through Patreon or something like that. There will be ways to find me and to message me, and I've put some contact details at the end of the podcast, and I'll also put some things in the show notes. So these adverts, of course, we're not going to discuss in great detail because, well, it's the same as what's in the books. Forces of Fantasy, the first volume, which is titled Forces of Fantasy, it gives you what you expect. You get some Forces of Fantasy. It's got a very brief one-page introduction, and then the rest of the book, which is 45 pages, probably a little bit more because the last entry is on page 45, I see in the table of contents. All of those pages, so over 40 pages, are just the entries, like what's called, like an army list booklet. So let's start with the introduction. After the introduction page, you get a section called Fighting Battalions. Fighting Battalions gives you some rules for choosing your armies. So if you're used to building armies, then this is a little bit different. What happens is you get a battalion, and a battalion consists of a number of regiments to the combined value of 1000 points. So this is usually one personality model, which we will later call a character, and there are some, the rest are of course regular troops. So you get around 1000 points of troops that you choose from one of those lists. If you make an army consists of 3 battalions. So you have to make each battalion using the appropriate list. You can have 3 battalions of the same creatures, or you may choose 3 different battalions. The only restriction is that you may not mix good and evil aligned battalions into the same army. So this is a little bit like the 5th edition Chaos book, the one that I played for the tournament the other day. It wasn't a tournament, it was a regular games day. So what you do there is you select a commander, and you select some retinues, and then you select a new commander, and this way you create some warbands, and those make up the army. This is what we did in 1st edition. So a battle was 3000 points. There are of course some rules where you say, well, you can have less in your battalion, say smaller amount, 500 points, or maybe less battalions in your army. But yeah, that's basically what you get. There are some rules for how to choose your troops. Regiments are usually between 5 and 30 models. They all have the same profile. I think they should also all have the same armor, but I'm not sure. No, they could have assorted weaponry, so some could have spears, some axes. Probably all depends on the model. What you see is what you get. Each regiment must have a regimental leader, and the leader is the last model to go, the last one to die when your regiment gets killed. These leaders have some extra rules. This depends all upon their own leadership, and well, there are some things that they can do with that. Apart from leaders, you can also have a regimental champion. So what you see in later editions, in 4th and 5th edition, you still have that concept of a leader and a champion. From 6th edition onwards, the champion is by default the leader. So, well, of course, unless you have a hero in there, but then still your regimental champion follows the same rules for a leader. So, what you have here is you have the leader, who is basically the tactical mastermind of the unit. He will tell the unit where to go and what to do. And the champion is just the best warrior in the unit, the one that will always be shoved forward and always be in the thickest of the fighting. So I didn't really realize that from reading the 4th edition books. This is something that I just now saw, that the leader and the champion are two different things. And at least in 4th edition, which is the edition that I am, the oldest edition that I am most familiar with, then in that era, the leader doesn't really have an added value to the unit, because the champion usually takes on the role of leader. But over here it makes sense that you have a different regimental champion that's something else than your leader. You also have the rules for standards, banners. You can capture the standards. That's a thing that was around in 1st edition and that will stay around. Some rules about musicians, and then it moves on to heroes and wizards. There are some rules here, some tables where you can have your hero or wizard employ magic weapons. They give you a D10 table, and you can have some simple magic weapon for 30 points. You pay 30 points for a single roll, and you can roll up to 3 times for your mighty heroes. And each roll gives you something like +3 initiative, +1 to hit, +1 on the to kill score, which would later become to wound, +1 attack, +1 wound, some special attributes, and then you have to roll again on the next chart and stuff like that. So these are some simple ways to make your heroes better without having to look through a lot of individual magic items, if that's something that you don't want to do or maybe don't have time for, and a good way to randomize magic items as well. There are some things here next about the different weapon options and their basic point values. You can have swords or other hand weapons for 0.5 point, spears are 0.5 point, and it goes up for all the way from like mithril armor for 50 points. And you can have an extra, you pay extra for regimental standards, which is 100 points, and for a musician you pay 50 points extra. But most of the weapons and armor in this list are either 1/2, 1, 1.5, or 2 points. And those 3, mithril armor, standard, and musician, are the only ones that are higher than 2 points per model. Gives you some examples of how to build this, and then it moves on to the list. The first section is the race of men. There are 4 types, I believe. Let me quickly check the table of contents. 4 types of human armies that you can have. These are the men of the East, which have an Arabian flavor, so this will be later evolve into Araby. The men of the North, which are Norsemen, but I believe they also have some... no, these are not the ones that will become Empire and Bretonnia later on. Next one is the men of the Orient, which will become Nippon and Cathay. And then finally you have the men of the West. And the men of the West are what will become your Bretonians, I think. I don't think Empire is its own thing yet. If you look at the men of the West table, you get knights, men-at-arms, crossbowmen, longbowmen, light infantry, peasants, mounted knights, mounted men-at-arms. All these tables give you also some random generations. So I don't really know when you would apply that, because it's not one making an army, but I think more in games that have more role-playing elements in them. If your GM wants you to come across a band of men of the West, then he might roll a couple of D100s and get maybe a character or some peasants, some infantry, and a knight, let's say something like that. The next section is dwarves, and dwarves is divided into dwarves, which are, well, what you expect them to be. The regular dwarves, they have a war machine called a bolt thrower, and the other ones are guardsmen, warriors, militia, and you have mounted dwarves. I'm not sure what they are mounted on, but I think that they can just be on horses or something. It doesn't really say here. You do have in the table of equipment. Let's see. No, it doesn't really say what kind of mount that they are on. So it might be just that everything here in this edition is horses. I'm not really sure how that works yet, so excuse me for not being too intimately familiar with these rules. So you got dwarves, and then in the subsection of dwarves you also have gnomes and halflings. These both had their own force. The gnomes, they look like dwarves but with pointy hats, so I do imagine them to be weaponized garden gnomes. And halflings, of course, your basic hobbit type, barefoot, woolly toes, and very fond of food, and it doesn't really have, not really fighters in the sense that you'd expect an army of them, but it might be nice to have a regiment of halflings, or what's called a battalion of halflings, to supplement your maybe your dwarves or your humans even. Then we go to the section of elves. Elves also, like humans, have 4 subsections. Dark elves, which speak for themselves. High elves, which also speak for themselves. And wood elves, but before we get to the wood elves, there's also the sea elves. Sea elves were not really their own thing after Oldhammer. They sort of got grouped in with the high elves. Their choices are not really that spectacular. You can choose between spearmen, warriors, cavalry, or of course the personalities, the heroes or the wizards. I think these will form the basis of what later would become the Lothern Sea Guard and maybe the elves of the Outer Kingdoms of Ulthuan. Although I'm not very sure about that, if that's the inspiration. They sort of just disappear from the books at some point. Although they still were around in 3rd edition, if I remember correctly, from the little bit I leafed through those books. Next, after the elves, we get the subset of giants, which consists of a single entry, giants. You could have a regiment of giants or even an army of giants, something that you won't see until you get to the Age of Sigmar era, where you have a giant faction, the Sons of Behemoth, if I recall correctly. Now, giants are subdivided into small giants, giants, and true giants. These rules are basically just what you get with the Warhammer article that was in a White Dwarf, that was by Rick Priestley. These are just the same rules about how you can pick up something and bowl it, pick up boulders and bowl them into units. Some rules about alcohol, what they do, some random attacks, stuff like that. These are all the rules that I've mentioned before, so I'm not going over them very deeply. Next section are the goblinoids, and these have by far the most different races. It starts off with some general rules for goblinoids, and that has some of these are very familiar. So you have animosity rules that was around right at the very start of, well, maybe not the very start, but right at the beginning of Warhammer. And then the first of the races mentioned are Great Goblins. Great Goblins are, I'm not really sure what they are. They don't really seem to stick around very much. They are not orcs, because orcs are the separate thing. They can ride on boars, so they are a little bit bigger than the regular goblins that ride on wolves. For your great goblin regiments, you can also choose some lesser goblins that are part of the units. But these are maybe what would become the common goblins. Not really sure about that. Next one is night goblins, and night goblins are already very much what you'd expect them to be. They still have some cavalry in this edition. You can have wolf riders and boar riders, but they do already have fanatics. They have their warriors. They have their ranged troops, slingers in this case. And also here you have regular warriors and you have lesser warriors. The stats are a little bit different, but yeah, night goblins are definitely a thing. A lot of rules about the fanatics, what happens, how they move. Some rules about the ball and chain that they use. Next section is the red goblins, a lot less rules. I think these would later become the common goblins, because you got warriors, wolf riders, and you can have also some regular wolves mixed in. Then we have the hobgoblins, which are what you'd expect them to be. The things that later would ally with the chaos dwarves. Although you do have here not just hobgoblin warriors, but you also have hobhounds, which are a hobgoblin wolf or hobgoblin dog sort of combination. Then you got the orcs. Orcs are also very much what you expect them. For some reason, orcs ride on wolves and not on boars in this edition. But you do get wyvern riders, you get chariots, bolt throwers, stone throwers. So already the very basic beginnings of what would later be the mainstay of the orcs. And of course orc warriors and what's called here orc guards, which are sort of your elite troops. Then we move on to the cold bloods, subdivided into two sections, lizardmen and slan. Lizardmen are what would later become the skinks and the sauruses. You have troglodytes, lizard warriors, lesser lizards, cold one riders, and of course the cold one that they ride on. And slan are they are their own thing. They are foot troops here in this edition. They're not yet the big toads that sit on palanquins and just stare off into the distance all day, being not really here on this plane. There are a lot of different troops in your slan list, and these troops will sound familiar to you if you've listened to last week's episode, where we talked about the scenario of Kremlo the Slan, which is in the Citadel Compendium, the first Citadel Compendium. Kremlo the Slan, the unlikely leader of a Norse village that will face off against his own kind. So for the Slan you can choose Palace Guards, you can choose Empire Soldiers, you can choose Cold One Riders, they have Warhounds with Handlers, Tribal Warriors that can have either water scythes or blowpipes, and Young Braves that can have either tomahawks or blowpipes. They also got eunuch slaves and of course characters as always. There are some special rules for the Slan, some special provisions. The slaves, for example, are human captives, so they, when I say here Empire Soldier, this is the Slan Empire, and I don't think it's going to be the Empire of Men, so don't think Expedition Force to Lustria just yet, although they might have had this in mind. I don't think these are regular humans if I look at their stat lines. The next section is, next we get three sections, the final three sections in this book. The first one is Chaos with only one subset called Chaos. Then we got Undead with only one subset, Undead. And then Monsters, which is subdivided into Goodly Hosts and Marauding Monsters. So for Chaos you have a lot of things that that are familiar to later era Chaos players. You can have a Beastman, you can have your Chaos Warriors, Trolls, Centaurs, Hydras, Griffins, Hippogriffs, Chimeras, Harpies, Manticores, they are all part of Chaos. Interestingly enough, Skeletons and Zombies are as well, and you also get Demons and Demonic Beasts. And Demons and Demonic Beasts, they've got their own set of rules. It says here that their stats and their point costs vary. Chaos Bit is a bit of an odd one out in this book, because by its very nature, a Chaos Force, it says here, is always a distinctly one-off formation, no such thing as a ready-made Chaos Army. Players wishing to general the Chaos Hordes will have to assemble their armies after generating their champions, followers, and appropriately weird Chaos creatures, using the various charts contained in our Arcane Realm of Chaos publication. I think that this Arcane Realm of Chaos publication that they are referring to did not actually come out during this time. This might be what later in 3rd edition evolved into the 2 Realm of Chaos books, Slave to Darkness and the Lost in the Damned. I'm not quite sure though, but I have so far not been able to track down anything from the 1st or 2nd edition era that could potentially be called Realm of Chaos supplement. It says here that you will probably need to model up and convert your own troops for this army, and it's okay, even though that this is a one-off army, you can still use your troops time and time again. The only rule they have is that you make a new Chaos General every time, once he or she or it is finally and irrevocably dead after attempting an after-battle saving throw on the injuries chart in volume 3 of the main rules. He must be rolled up again. And if your army includes a Necromancer, either as part of the Chaos Horde or as an ally commanding his own battalion, then he may return as an undead champion of Chaos. So yeah, lots of fun over there, but you do need a new Chaos General then. So Chaos, a bit of a weird one here. And yeah, if you know a little bit more about this and the way that this was supposed to function, then please let me know, because they do reference the Realm of Chaos supplement a couple of times. And the only Realm of Chaos supplement I know of was released back in 1987 and 1988 as those 2 books. And then of course later you had Realm of Chaos as the 5th edition box set. But I'm pretty sure they're not talking about that one. So then we move on to Undead. These are the things that you find mostly in the 4th edition Undead book. Skeletons, skeleton horsemen, zombies, ghouls, wraiths, wights, mummies, specters, and of course you got your characters, necromancers, stuff like that. No vampires for some reason. I think maybe there are some vampires in there as well, although I am not quite sure. And the champion says here necromancers and liches. Let's see. Well, they did get rules for vampires in the Citadel Compendium, so you can always use those. And then finally you get the 2 sections of the Goodly Hosts and the Marauding Monsters. Good things are stuff like dragons, but they can also be evil. Eagle, Pegasus, Treeman, Unicorn. You got Winged Panthers in this edition, and Winged Serpents. These are more of the Mesoamerica type monsters. And then for the marauding monsters, the evil ones, you get carnivorous birds, of course also the dragons like I mentioned. Giant frogs are evil, giant insects such as spiders, scorpions and stuff like that are evil. Giant rats, giant reptiles, a Jabberwock minotaur, serpent crawler and wolves are all evil creatures. Welcome back to the good old days where you could print swastikas in Warhammer rulebooks and get away with it. I'm talking of the Forces of Fantasy supplement, Fighting Fantasy Battles, the second book, second volume of the Forces of Fantasy box set. In this book, we get at first a little bit about how you play a game, not so much the rules, but more the setup. So it says here, and I'm just going to read out this little blurb, this little introduction. If two players are going to fight a fantasy battle, then the first thing they will need is a third person to act as the game's master, GM, or umpire. So, if you want to play a game of fantasy battles, the first thing they say is get a games master. Then you get a little bit a section about setting up the battlefield, which gives you some ideas for the games master how to do this. And then in step 4 of this, it says if you have no GM, then you can use method 3 above, which is ask the players to write down how many pieces of scenery that they want on their table half, up to a maximum of 1 item per 1 foot of table length. And then roll a d6 and then place pieces in alternating shape, alternating form. So you can do it like that if you don't have a GM. Or you can roll 2d6 and that will give you some options, a table with, for example, a graveyard, river, small building, bog, hill, hedge, lake, soft sand, stuff like that. So the first thing you need if you want to play a game is a GM, but if you don't have a GM, you can apparently also play a game. Next, you get a very fun section, something that I would like to try out in later games of Warhammer as well, because I think you can do that very well. It gives you a... this is an advanced rule, and the advanced rule says that certain features can have a percentage chance of a random encounter. So, for example, if you have woods, you roll a d100, and on the roll of a 1 to 5, you get a spider's den, which gives you a 5% chance of entanglement per model and 1 to 3 giant spiders. If you roll a 6, you get a scorpion lair with 1 giant scorpion. If you roll a 7, you get a wolf den with 1 to 6 pack wolves, so I guess that's 1d6. And if you roll an 8 to 10, you get 1 or 2 treemen. And if you roll 11 or all the way up to 100, you get nothing. At least it doesn't say you get anything, so I assume you get nothing. So yeah, this gives you some ideas, usually for up to 10, sometimes 15% chance that there is an infestation in one of these terrain features. Very nice to do that and to apply that to later games as well. And of course, in a game of first edition, these creatures would be played by the games master, so he would decide which to attack. But you can, of course, also incorporate rules that they would automatically attack the closest unit, or in the case of a territorial creature, that they would only attack things that are in or near the terrain feature, and then when they are not destroyed, or if they for example chase off the attackers, then they will pursue for 1 round and then move straight back to the terrain feature. There's several rules that you can imagine here where you can use this for games of Warhammer in later editions as well. Then we get a little bit about deployment. You can either have an alternating deployment, or that you write down which unit you want to place where blindly on a piece of paper. Your opponent does the same, and then you give them to the GM, and then you set them up. And next we get a section on engines of war. We get the rules for bolt throwers, we get the rules for stone throwers, and we get the rules for chariots. I'm not going into these rules in detail because, well, I think I don't think that will make for a very interesting type of podcast to go over all of these rules. But also, if it would take a lot of time, and most people won't use these rules, so it's not really useful for them anyway. Next, we get a section on using these war machines against fortifications and buildings. I think this is also in the advanced rules section. No, not really. No, so these are regular rules. So you can use your catapults to destroy buildings. You may have noticed already that there are no gunpowder weapons here yet in this edition. So no cannons, no mortars. That's all coming around in later editions. I don't know exactly when, but we will find out when we get there. There are some rules for fire weapons, for example, if you use flaming ammunition in your catapult. And then we get a section that may or may not have been in the Citadel Compendium, the first Citadel Compendium, because there are some things here that do seem very familiar. Things about the turn sequence, a little clarification there, some weapon differentiation bonuses, the rules for return fighting and fighting defensively, both as advanced rules. There are rules for magicians and armor with the fumble factor that I definitely know was in the Forces of Fantasy the Citadel Compendium section. Something about the advanced rules for personal characteristics. So this is just a reprint of those rules. Next we get a section on mounted troops, also advanced rules. There's a little logo that appears every time that you have advanced rules. So this is all for experienced players. Next one, we get a page devoted to mercenaries, hiring mercenaries. And I do believe this is also something that we've seen before. Though I'm not certain. I should maybe listen to my own podcast a little bit more to see what's in there. I'm not too intimately familiar with these books. But yeah, you can hire mercenaries that give you some rules for generating random mercenary bands. And then the next part of this book, which is most of it, if not all of it, well, not all of it, but most of it is dedicated to the different factions that we saw in the Forces of Fantasy book, the first book of this supplement, the one that we did last week. All of these armies are now in alphabetical order. I believe it's alphabetical order. They are... No, sorry, not in alphabetical order, but they are in the order that they appeared in the Forces of Fantasy book. Except that now you don't get the rules, stats, and point cost of the models, but you get the background information, you get the fluff, and you also get a lot of drawings of, for example, shield designs, banner designs, symbols, alphabets, stuff like that. So, for example, it starts off with chaos, and you always get the same three sections: organization, tactics, and painting. So I'll just read one out. So for chaos regiments may be of from 16 to 24 models for most infantry, with monsters and other troops in units of a convenient size. Tactics: with such a diversity of troops, the Chaos General may adapt his tactics freely as he sees fit. Well, that's not much help. Most of the troops are better than average fighters, which favors a straightforward advance and attack. Nothing new there, because that's always the way that Chaos has been played apparently. Ample support can be obtained from any of the monster types, either fighting alongside conventional units or attacking already engaged units in the rear. And then the painting section: Chaos troops wear black. Some individuals, however, can wear clothing of any color. Even garish patterns or weird and frightening pictorial scenes can appear. Armor for the majority is black, but can be colored, make glow, fluorescent paint, or change color from time to time. Alternatively, armor can be highly decorated with gems of precious metal. With some chaotic mutations, armor, clothing, and flesh may become physically intermixed so that the armor takes on flesh tints whilst flesh becoming metallic. Chaos Beastmen are often pale grey with pink inside ears, nostrils, and corners of their eyes, Weapons can be any metallic color, black, red or white. Shields may be any color, some can be metallic. And then you get a lot of shield designs, for example with a goat skull, I think it's a goat, other skulls, several different eye symbols. There's one with a snake that well, how should I describe this? This is a frontal view of a snake that's opening its mouth with the fangs and the tongue coming out. But then there's also 2 goat horns that appear to come off from the snake itself. There's a wolf face, there's a face of a guy with no eyes. So yeah, different kinds of symbols here. And you get this for all the different factions. Men of the West, Men of the Orient, that's the one where you get the swastika symbol. Also some typical Asian banners like the long back banners that you get. Let's see, the Men of the West are the more European heraldry and symbolism. Men of the East, these are the Arabian type symbols with some Arabian style calligraphy and other symbolism like elephants and mixed animals there. Norsemen, I don't really know where those banners go, but I'd expect them to be more like Viking-ish, but the banners that are depicted next to them have a more Asian type look, but then again there are some runes on there, so I guess that those are the Norsemen. Dwarves, they sort of speak for themselves, haven't changed much. Axes, hammers, there are some fierce monsters on there, some runes as well. Then we get a 2-page spread, a drawing of some dark elves and some orcs fighting in the woods, coming across each other, brandishing weapons, looking fierce on both sides. Very nice picture. And then we get the dark elves, high elves, sea elves and wood elves on the next spread. Yeah, the symbols are what you'd expect them to be. So things like ships and fish and sea monsters for the sea elves, things like trees and butterflies for the wood elves. Dark elves, lots of skull symbolry. High elves, things like swords and the stars and moons, stuff like that. Next one is the giants, the gnomes, the great goblins, the red goblins. They've got a lot of wolf symbolism there and skulls and bones for the orcs, for the goblins as well. Night goblins, I notice a distinct lack in night goblins of the moon, the bad moon. There is one which is a crescent moon with the opening to the bottom, so an upside down crescent moon. But there is a red face on the shield, or a red head on the shield for the night goblins, and there's a skull kind of thing with bat wings on the banner. Halflings, already you see the rooster there, that's become synonymous with halflings in later editions. Then we get hobgoblins. They've also got some wolf and rat type symbols there. Lizardmen with snakes and stuff like that, and lizards. Orcs. The orcs for at least on one of their banners have the bad moon symbol. So the regular moon that you'd see for the night goblins in later editions already here. And also some other symbolism that has stuck around, like skulls and an eye and a dragon type thing. And then you get the slan, these look more Aztec-like. And the undead, exactly what you'd expect. Things like skulls, fangs, bat wings, stuff like that. And then we get into a lovely section called Regiments of Renown. And some of these regiments have stayed around for a very long time. I'm not going into detail on these either, because, well, most of them don't really have any special rules. It's just things like the stats that they have and the weapons and the armor that are given here. But let's pick out some names here. You get Buckman's Dwarf Rangers, already in 1st edition, with a shield with a beer mark on it. You get the Knights of Origo. These look like what later would become Bretonnians. You get Grom's Goblin Guard. Grom, a fat goblin, but not yet standing in a chariot, but I guess it's the same Grom. Mangle Manhite's Company of Dark Elves. They were re-released around 6th edition, maybe even for the Storm of Chaos, but I'm not sure about that one. Let's see, these have not gotten any new releases as far as I know. Harboth and the Black Mountain Boys and Matt Muller, Ackland's Death Commandos. So Harboth and the Mountain Boys are orcs and the Death Commandos are Arabians. You get the Bowmen of Orion, spelled with an E, O-R-E-O-N. If you replace the E with an I, Orion, then you see what these guys are supposed to be. So, Wood Elf Archers, that were a regiment of renown back in the day. And we close off this section with Golgvac and his mercenary ogres. Nice to see them already in 1st edition. Then the final section of this book is called Heroes and Wizards. This gives you an easy role to make some interesting heroes, wizards, and of course also some retinues, companions. They give you the rules to roll the stats for men, elves, and dwarves. For both heroes and wizards of each of these races. So yeah, dwarves could have wizards back in the day. They also have a chance to get a fantastic mount, stuff like a giant wolf, centaur, griffin, something like that. Depending also on if you have a neutral or a good wizard, neutral, evil, or good wizard or hero. And you get the followers for the elves, men, and dwarves. And also for the wizards. The wizards get different followers, I see. So, yeah, what I'm going to do for the Patreon is I'm going over these pages and roll up at least one random character. And let's just see how this goes and how it goes with the tables leading to other tables and stuff like that. So if you want to know more about that, then join the Patreon, please. Before I let you go, I've got another book that I want to take a look at, which is the book called Arcane Magicks. Volume 3 of this set, Arcane Magicks, contains, well, you might have guessed it, the rules for magic. It starts off with some new magic items. These magic items are tailored to Oriental armies, Arabian armies, so you get things like magic carpets, enchanted ropes, things that come out of a pot and that you can climb up in if you blow the right kind of melody on a flute. Some different kinds of magic items here, and there's also some random generation tables as well for a GM. You get stuff like boots, different kinds of boots, different kinds of potions, and then we get to a section called Treasure. Now, this is a very fun section because this reminds me very much of when I was a DM in a very long-running 3rd edition, 3.5 edition D&D game. At the end of every encounter, you'd roll for treasure, and that was one of the favorite things to do. There were these tables, and you'd get a so many % chance of so much gold, or of so many gems, or magic items even. Depending on the level of the characters, you got these tables. Now you got something similar over here. You've got a chart for which you have to turn your book so that it's in portrait, no, what's it called, landscape form, not in portrait, single page in landscape. And then you've got different kinds of buildings. For example, you've got a house, workshop, wizard's house. You've also got just things like money or a menagerie. And you've got a percentage chance of rolling things like a random magic item, a random amulet, an object dart, an artifact, an art piece of art. Animals even are there, and these tables lead to Other tables, things like domestic articles, animals and plants. You get small mammals, you get large mammals, all kinds of stuff. And the fun thing is, even with the object dart, the art object, you have a chance of getting a miniature. So you could play a miniatures game where your miniatures loot a miniature house and then get a miniature, or maybe even a whole case of miniatures, and they can play their own game of Warhammer inside a game of Warhammer. And if you do that and then roll up on the same table, you get this sort of Warhammer Inception thing. I'm not sure if anyone has ever done that, but yeah, this, if I were a GM, I would definitely allow something like that to happen. Next on, we get a section on some new monsters, also oriented towards the Orient. These are things like genies and Efreet, but we also get some more Western monsters like Chaos Chimeras and Hydras. Then we get a, let me see if I can get the page, got two of the pages together here. Oh, and also one of the monsters that I should mention here, that have been later removed for obvious copyright reasons, are Balrogs. So a Balrog was a monster that you could field, although it would set you back 1500 points. Let's take a quick look at the stat line. Movement 12, weapon skill, ballistic skill 10, strength 6, toughness F, which is the highest toughness class you can get, if I recall correctly, 15 wounds, initiative 10, and 10 attacks. They cause fear in enemies that can see them and terror in enemies within 15 inches. They can command up to 3 regiments of orcs, goblins, trolls, or hobgoblins. And a regiment under the command of a Balrog never needs to test for morale and ignores all psychology tests. They may fly or move normally. They've got a flame sword and a flame whip. They can even have armor, but Balrog armor does not in any way prevent the Balrog from using his magic. Did I tell you already? No, I didn't. He's also a magic user. He's got 3 elemental spells, and we will talk about the elemental spells in a little bit. So, yeah, that's definitely a nice monster that you can field. Not sure if many people would do that in first edition. Definitely not in a first battle, a 1500 point monster. This is basically a one-man army, I think. Very difficult to knock some wounds off of him, and especially with the whole immune to psychology thing like that. Yeah, I don't really think that this is an opponent you'd like to face. But yeah, nice that they have included him, and that this apparently is also the big bad guy, the Tarask of Warhammer Fantasy First Edition, the largest, scariest monster that you can face. So a big nod to Tolkien, of course, where the Balrog originated. And yeah, like I said, later on, removed for obvious copyright reasons. Next we get a section on infestations, and that probably doesn't say anything if I say it like that. But if you look at the picture, which is a lot of rats all running in the same direction, later editions, these would be known as swarms. And, well, as a matter of fact, even in this edition, these are known as swarms. Because, well, to create an infestation, take a circular piece of card 2 inches in radius. This will represent the area covered up by the hundreds or even thousands of creatures that compose the swarm. This card is moved around like any other piece on the table, except that movement is determined by rolling dice. So yeah, you get swarms, and you don't even get swarms with miniatures. You just put down a circular piece of paper, and that's your swarm. And then you get different types of swarms. Many of them will seem familiar because they stick around in later editions. Things like snakes and lizards, scorpions, bats, spiders, or some things that have disappeared, ants and ticks. Yeah, and these swarms, they have I don't think that you can buy them, but you can summon them. There are some spells later on that summon them. Speaking of spells, in the middle of the book, you get a summary of the spells that have been mentioned in the first edition core book, the first edition magic book. It was not really a summary, it's just a list with the random number, the random generation number, the name of the spell, and the talisman you need to cast the spell. And then you get a section on new spells. You get Summon Swarm and Summon Infestation, which are 2 levels of the same spell where you summon these swarms, and you also get Dispel Infestation, which of course can be used to dispel a swarm. You get some elemental spells, the ones that the Balrog also uses: Fire Blast, Flame Sheet, and Fire Bolt, also available at different levels. And then you get a very fun section on random magic item generation. Basically, you, as a GM, roll a D100, and depending on what number comes up, you refer to table 1 through 8, and each table gives you a D100 number, and it gives you also, in some cases, other tables. So, tables that lead to tables. I'm definitely going to see if I can include some magic items in the random character that I'm going to roll up for the Patreon. We get a whole section on magic weapons. Weapons can have an alignment, and weapons, they have different kinds of abilities. So, for example, if you have and it took me a little while to figure this out, and I believe I sort of figured this out whilst recording the unboxing video for the Patreon. So if you have a magic weapon, then you can have a weapon with certain types of abilities, and that means that you roll separately for each ability. So for example, you start with initiative level gain. That's a 25% that the user adds 1d10 to his initiative level. If you roll that 25%, that's the ability your weapon gets. If not, you go to the next one, which is 25% chance attack gain. And then you go to the next one, which is 20% strength gain or 15% chance of toughness gain. So, this is a way to generate these weapons. Although, if you are lucky enough, you roll, or unlucky enough, depending on how you look at it, you roll that 25% on the first roll, and then you get initiative, and then for your next weapon, you do the same thing. So, as a GM, you would probably want to tweak things like that. And these are just the ability gains. There's also things like special attack modes, things like stat drain, warp attack, sleep attack is mentioned there. And some extraordinary abilities: flight, breathe underwater, divine frenzy, dispel undead. A lot of things you can do with these weapons. Finally, you get a section on power weapons. And power weapons are, I think, sort of semi-sentient, because if you are a character who takes up a power weapon and the power level of the weapon is lower than the willpower of the character plus the number of wounds, then the character is the master of the weapon. But if that number is lower to the willpower plus number of wounds, the power level of the weapon is higher than the willpower and wounds of the character, then the character is the weapon's slave, and that gives you different abilities as well and different things that you can use. Basically, if you are the slave, the weapon uses you, and if you are the master, you can use the weapon. And then finally we close off with a section on rune weapons, different kinds of runes that you can have inscribed on your weapons. And these runes, they do things like Rune of Flight, which if you inscribe it on an axe or a hammer, it causes to always hit its target while thrown. And Rune of Return, which you want to have there as well. If you throw your axe or hammer, then it returns immediately to the hand of the owner. It says here it dims after you, so I assume that this is just a single activation thing like that. You can't use it every turn, maybe once per battle or maybe even once per weapon. I haven't dived into these rules very deeply.